Before I was interrupted by my daughter, we were talking about the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson, the first such action against a sitting president in the history of the United States. After the House voted on party lines, 128 to 47, to start with articles of impeachment against the president, a Senate trial took place from March 5th through May 26th of 1868. As allowed for in the Constitution, Supreme Court Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase presided over the trial, which became a huge spectacle. The Senate gallery was filled every day with people coming to D.C. to see this example of American democracy in process. And as said in the earlier piece, everyone expected that this was going to end with a guilty verdict, with Andrew Johnson's removal, and with the installation of a member of the Radical Republicans, Senator Benjamin Wade from Ohio, as the next president of the United States. Well, the final vote after a 5-week trial turned out to be 35 for the removal, 19 against the removal. It came up one vote short of removal. That one vote was a radical Republican senator by the name of Edmund Ross from Kansas. And again, Ross had not been a noticeable figure in the Senate. In fact, he was one of those guys that just kind of sat on the back benches and kept quiet. But Ross examined his political conscience, looked at what happened, and decided that he in good conscience could not vote for the removal of Andrew Johnson. He realized at that point, as he said later in his own papers, that when he understood that he was going to vote against Johnson's removal, that he was looking at his own open political grave. Remember that at this point, senators were elected by state legislatures and not by the people, which wouldn't come until the 20th century and the passage of the 18th Amendment, passage of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. So, what happens? Johnson's left in office. His presidency is all but destroyed. He is all but powerless by the end of the process, and in 1868 he will actually run for a term as president from the Democratic Party. He'll be defeated by the sitting governor of New York, who was Horace Seymour, and Seymour in turn would be defeated by the man that Johnson asked to be his Secretary of War, Republican Ulysses S. Grant, the former great military general. Ross himself would later become part of an award-winning book by a future president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, who wrote Profiles in Courage while he was a student at Harvard, and looked at Ross and a number of other political actors who went with their conscience and against the flow of usual things to stand up for what they believed in. Now, that brings us to the next step in the process and what happens with Reconstruction. By June of 1868, 8 of the remaining Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union. Only 4 remained: Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and Georgia. And they were considered to be the 4 most radical of the Confederate states. So in order to get back into the Union, those states had to agree to ratify the 15th Amendment, giving all blacks the right to vote and ensuring that there would be that kind of legal peace in mind for them. Now, the ironic thing in this whole issue of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments is that Kentucky was the only state not to ratify all 3 of the amendments. And, Kentucky was a border state during the Civil War, obviously had divided loyalties, and was not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation because they were afraid that if that had happened in Kentucky, that they might flip and go to the Confederacy. So just a point to think about. Now, let's move on. Even though the North believed in emancipation, emancipation didn't necessarily mean that they were going to be happy to see this influx of new black citizens. In fact, both northern and southern whites harbored racist views of blacks, and most whites familiar with the South would note that freed blacks rarely moved beyond the places where they had been enslaved, that they weren't willing to step out, move forward, and do something else with their lives. Now, to their credit, blacks get involved in several things. One, black involvement in the Union Army during the Civil War provides the opportunity for the first great generation of black leaders to emerge. Senators like Hiram Revels are going to make their mark in the South, and most of those ex-Army veterans are going to become the first group of political actors developed in the New South, developed in the post-Civil War South. Churches are going to become critical to the black community in all of those southern states. 1.3 million of the freed slaves, and if you really think about it, that's 65%, are going to become Baptists. Another 30% are going to join 5 or 6 other religious groups. They're also going to be very intentional about creating fraternal organizations, labor organizations, things that allow them to remain bonded to one another. And that sense of community is really going to play an important role in the development of black society in the South. Another piece that the blacks were very intentional about was the recreation of the families that had been broken up as a result of slavery. Most black households became two-parent households fairly quickly after the Civil War, and that became a critical element in their bonding and staying together. And even if you move to the current day, there's still a very strong-willed idea about the two-parent household and what it means to the black community. Most of the communities in the South, most of the black communities, are going to start building schools. And you're going to see the development of the historical black colleges and universities that we're all familiar with today, including one in Frankfort, Kentucky called Kentucky State University. You're going to see Howard and Grambling and these other institutions begin to develop because blacks place an emphasis on education in the post-Civil War South. Now, economically, you're going to see a couple of other things happen, and they're not necessarily positive. You're going to be looking at tenant farming, you're going to be looking at sharecropping, you're going to be looking at things that are meant to tie blacks to the land and to the South. So you have a very mixed record. On one hand, blacks take their new freedom seriously, and they work very hard to see that grow and develop. On the other hand, they have to deal with a whole subculture that really doesn't want to see that happen. And that's going to become a critical element in their moving forward. Okay? If you look at the radical record of Reconstruction, it's pretty amazing. The radicals are involved in building the Transcontinental Railroad and building a system of railroad networks across the country and through the South. Certainly the South never got the railroad mileage that the North got, but some was better than nothing. The record of public school creation was huge. It made a difference in literacy for both blacks and whites in the South and opened up new possibilities that the South hadn't really seen. State governments in the South are going to become more in tune to the plight of poor and orphans and others who had been left behind by earlier governments, and that was a good thing. Infrastructure, in large part, was going to be much better. On the other hand, the Republican record was also one of corruption. Contracts were often sold to the highest bidder with kickbacks. It was you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and we'll make things happen. They did make things happen, but in many cases those things turned out to be corrupt.